Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm really glad you're joining us today because we're taking a deep dive into something incredibly practical. But before we get into the sources, I want you to imagine something.
Okay.
Imagine for a second that you're standing in the middle of a river. You didn't want to cross this river, but circumstances basically forced you in.
Right.
At first, the water is just around your ankles. It's cold, it's uncomfortable, but you can see the other side. You tell yourself, God is with me, I can make it.
Yeah, you still have your footing.
But then the riverbed drops.
Yeah.
Suddenly the water is at your knees, pulling at your balance. Then it's at your waist. The current is vicious now. You're burning calories just trying to stay upright. And then the water hits your chest.
Oh.
It starts gurgling in your throat. You're choking. You are entirely out of options, and you realize you're going to drown. And in that exact fraction of a second, when the panic completely overtakes your nervous system, a voice whispers in your ear.
And we all know the whisper.
It says, if God actually loved you, you would not be drowning right now. He left you here.
It really is the most terrifying psychological strike a human being can endure. It hits when you have zero defenses left.
It does. And that specific moment of despair is our mission today. We are taking a massive, unhurried look at Charles Spurgeon's classic text, Dilemma and Deliverance.
Which is anchored to a single line from Psalm 9.10,
Yeah.
right? Thou, Lord, hast not forsaken them that seek thee.
Yes, precisely. And if you are listening to this on your commute or, while washing dishes, I want to set the stakes right up front. This is not some abstract theological history lesson. We are looking at a tactical manual for surviving intense, suffocating periods of doubt and anxiety.
The stakes are quite literally life and death for the human mind. Because Spurgeon is operating on a very specific premise here. He argues that possessing actual historical knowledge of God functions as a literal suit of divine armor.
A suit of armor.
Yeah. And that armor has one primary purpose: to deflect the most lethal, calculated attacks on your sanity and your faith. But before he even gets to the mechanics of the armor, he points a very sharp finger at how distracted we are.
Oh, I loved this part.
He argues we're walking onto a battlefield completely naked by choice.
I was really struck by his critique of the educational system of his era, the 19th century. He points out that society forced young men to spend thousands of hours memorizing heathen mythologies.
Right, learning the entire lineage of the Greek and Latin pantheons.
Yeah, he does not hold back on his disdain for this. He calls those fables filth and vanities. His central complaint is that a culture will spend vast resources ensuring its youth know the fictional history of a fake god like Jupiter, while allowing them to remain completely ignorant of Jehovah's actual historical acts on earth.
And he equates this ignorance of God directly with an ignorance of bliss. His logic is just striking. If you don't know the attributes of God, if you don't know how he has acted in history, how he keeps his covenants, how he manages crises, you have zero internal resources when a crisis hits.
You're a completely soft target for despair.
Absolutely. You have nothing to draw from.
Reading that section, I couldn't help but map it directly onto our modern culture. We aren't forcing kids to memorize Latin poetry about Apollo anymore, sure, but look at the sheer volume of fictional lore we absorb and memorize today.
Oh, it's staggering.
Right. People know the intricate, decades-long timelines of massive cinematic universes. We can recite the backstory of fictional superheroes.
Yeah, or we track the daily movements of celebrities.
We memorize the statistical history of sports franchises. We basically have hard drives in our brains filled with data that has zero capacity to sustain us in a tragedy. Yet when it comes to basic, life-saving spiritual knowledge, there is a massive void.
And that void is a severe liability. Spurgeon uses this great agricultural image to illustrate the alternative. He quotes the text describing the righteous person as being like a tree planted by the rivers of water, thy leaf shall not wither.
I love that imagery.
Think about the mechanics of a tree planted near a permanent water source. When a brutal summer drought hits, the grass turns brown, the shallow plants die. But the tree with deep roots tapping into that hidden river, it doesn't panic.
Because the blistering heat is external.
Precisely. The sustaining water source is internal and hidden.
So if your mind is heavily stocked with the knowledge of who God is, his character, his historical track record of managing impossible situations, you have that hidden reservoir. When the external climate of your life becomes unbearable, your leaf doesn't wither. You have an internal supply of truth.
Right. That hidden reservoir is the divine armor. But, the concept of armor implies that there is a specific weapon being fired at you. Armor isn't decorative, it's functional.
Right. So if knowing God is the armor, what is the specific weapon? What is the actual threat we are supposed to be deflecting here?
Well, Spurgeon identifies the enemy's primary strategy. He argues that Satan has an entire quiver full of arrows. He shoots temptations to greed, insinuations of lust, little doubts, provocations to anger.
The usual suspects.
Yeah, the usual. But among all those weapons, there is one specific arrow that exceeds all others in its lethal capacity. He calls it the absolute masterpiece of hell.
The suggestion that God has forsaken you.
That is the one. Spurgeon states that if you took every other temptation from hell, gathered them all together, and extracted their poison, there would not be as much deadly venom in that entire batch as there is in this single terrifying suggestion.
I kept chewing on that claim. I mean, out of all the horrific things the enemy could tempt a person to do or believe, why is that specific thought the most poisonous? It feels, on the surface, just like a symptom of depression.
Sure.
But Spurgeon places it at the very top of the threat list. Why?
Because it targets the core structural relationship of the universe. If a hostile entity can convince you that your supreme protector, the God who made a covenant with you, has walked away in disgust or apathy, every other defense mechanism you have instantly crumbles.
You become completely isolated.
And an isolated target is the easiest target to destroy. To make this really practical, Spurgeon breaks down 4 distinct seasons when this specific fiery dart is most likely to be shot.
I really want to spend significant time on these 4 seasons because if you are listening to this, you will probably recognize at least one of these scenarios from your own life.
Oh, without a doubt.
So the first season of attack happens immediately after falling into sin. Spurgeon paints this incredibly vivid, agonizing psychological state. You have done something wrong, your conscience is awake, and it is pricking you. You feel the heavy, crushing weight of the error.
Yeah.
So you do what you're supposed to do. You fall on your knees, you go to your closet, and you begin to confess.
And the timing of the strike here is completely malicious. You are entirely vulnerable. You are agreeing with God's law, admitting you failed. You are stripped of your pride, and right in the middle of that raw confession, the arrow hits.
The dark thought crosses your mind. God will blot your name out of the covenant. You have sinned so foully, so repeatedly, that he will never accept you again.
Spurgeon actually quotes the internal monologue of the despairing person here. He says, "You are fit for nothing but the dunghill, like salt that has lost its savor." The enemy takes your genuine, necessary conviction of sin and twists it into a sentence of eternal condemnation.
That is such a devastating maneuver. You think you're engaging in repentance, which is supposed to lead to healing, but you are actually spiraling into absolute despair. The enemy weaponizes your own sorrow against you.
He does.
He wants you to believe that your failure is significantly larger than God's covenant grace. He wants you to conclude that the grace of God has a finite limit and you just crossed the boundary line forever.
Which brings us to the second season of attack. There's a psychological shift when the pain isn't your fault. We just talked about sin, where you brought the trouble on yourself. But what about when the crisis is entirely external?
Right.
Spurgeon identifies times of great trouble as the next prime opportunity for the arrow. This is where he uses that terrifying analogy of wading across the broad, fast-moving river that we mentioned at the start.
Let's expand on that river analogy because it captures the physiological panic of a crisis so well. You step into the water of affliction. Maybe it's a bad medical diagnosis for a family member. At first, the water is at your knees. You're managing the appointments. You're handling the stress. You tell yourself, God is sovereign. We will get through this.
But then the condition worsens.
Yeah. The water reaches your chest. You're struggling to breathe. The medical bills are piling up. The treatments are failing.
You're losing your footing. The current is dragging you down.
And then the water gets higher. It is physically gurgling in your throat. You are on the verge of drowning under the weight of the affliction. And Spurgeon says, right at that exact second, when you are in the deepest, most lethal part of the stream, Satan appears on the bank.
Yeah, he draws his bow.
And he shoots the arrow, "Thy God has forsaken thee."
The sheer cruelty of that timing is what marks it as a supernatural attack. The enemy hits a person when they are entirely incapacitated. Look, when you are standing on dry land on a sunny day, you can fight back against theological doubts. You can quote scripture.
You feel strong.
Right. But when you are choking on the waters of affliction, when the bank account reads 0, when the doctor shakes his head, when the spouse walks out the door, that is when the whisper is most convincing. If God loved you, this water would not be in your throat.
It is the ultimate kick when you are down. And then Spurgeon moves to the third season, which fascinated me because it's so personal to him, the attack before a period of great labor.
Yes, Spurgeon gets very transparent here. He talks about his own intense anxiety before preaching to thousands of people.
We have to contextualize this for the listener. Charles Spurgeon was arguably the most famous preacher of the Victorian era. He routinely spoke to crowds of 6, 8, 10,000 people in massive auditoriums, entirely without a microphone.
Just a massive voice.
An absolute titan of public speaking, and yet he openly admits to being frequently paralyzed by the fear of failing right before he stepped onto the platform.
He describes the dread of laboring in vain. He uses this heavy, exhausting agricultural imagery. He looks at the field he has to plow. The soil is hard and deep. The plow itself is incredibly heavy. The oxen are faint and tired.
He's just exhausted before he even starts.
Well, yes. He's staring at this monumental, impossible task ahead of him, feeling his own physical and mental limitations. And in that moment of exhaustion, the dark thought rises. The Lord has forsaken you. You will fall before this congregation. Your strength will be spent for absolutely nothing, and you will be humiliated.
I look at that and see imposter syndrome weaponized to the absolute highest degree. You look at the duty sitting in front of you. Maybe for the listener, it's a massive company-saving project at work.
Or a family situation.
Yeah, maybe it's bringing your first newborn child home from the hospital and realizing you are entirely responsible for keeping this fragile human alive. Maybe it's taking on the full-time care of a parent with severe dementia. The plow is incredibly heavy. The field is massive.
And the lie whispers that you are going to be left to pull that heavy iron plow entirely by yourself, and you will inevitably collapse in the dirt.
And finally, we hit the fourth season of Attack Times of Unanswered Prayer. This one is perhaps the most universally understood experience for anyone who has practiced faith for more than a few weeks. You've taken a severe issue to God, you've pleaded your case, you've gone to the closet 5, 10, 20 times, you have wept, you have quoted the promises.
And there's just silence. Zero movement.
The burden is still sitting right there on your back.
Yeah.
The situation might even be getting worse.
Spurgeon says this is when the enemy whispers that the heavens above you are made of solid brass. Your prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling. He suggests that the Shekinah glory, the visible presence of God, has permanently left the building.
He uses the word Ichabod, right?
Yes, Ichabod, which historically means the glory has departed. You are staring at the door of the room where you pray, and the enemy is telling you to just give up. Stop speaking to the wind. God has shut his ear to you.
I'm listening to these 4 scenarios, and I have to throw out a massive skeptical challenge here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Is this concept of a literal fiery dart just a flowery 19th century metaphor for what we now understand as modern burnout? Are we just talking about clinical guilt, cortisol spikes, and stress? Or is Spurgeon actually describing an active, calculating, malevolent intelligence that is plotting these strikes at our absolute weakest biological and psychological moments?
If we follow the logical progression of Spurgeon's text, he's absolutely describing a malevolent intelligence. He explicitly calls the enemy a coward who deliberately waits in the shadows for the water to reach your throat before striking.
So it's not just brain chemistry.
Right. Now, burnout, adrenal fatigue, and stress are real physiological realities.
Yeah.
But Spurgeon's framework argues that those vulnerable, depleted biological states are actively exploited by an adversary. The timing is far too precise. The lie is too perfectly tailored to the specific insecurity of the moment to just be random brain chemistry misfiring.
The timing is the giveaway.
Yes, the sudden, overwhelming feeling of abandonment is a calculated external strike meant to destroy you.
Identifying the arrow and understanding the timing of when it is shot is one thing. But Spurgeon has a lot to say about the actual internal damage this specific wound causes. He dissects the anatomy of the spiritual wound.
He classifies it in 2 ways. He describes it as both grievous and dangerous. It is grievous because, as he points out, other troubles are basically surface storms. You might lose your job. You might face vicious public criticism. Those events create massive, choppy waves on the surface of your life.
But underneath, you're okay.
Right. Down in the deep caverns of your soul, if you believe God is with you, you can still maintain a baseline of calm trust in providence. You can sleep at night.
But this specific arrow, the intrusive belief that God has actively abandoned you, it takes the ocean of your soul and boils it all the way to the sandy bottom.
There is no calm cavern left to retreat into.
The text says it bypasses the buckler, finds the tiny joints in the armor, and acts like a sword grinding directly into your bones. It removes your ability to find rest anywhere.
And that complete loss of baseline peace leads directly to the dangerous nature of the wound. Spurgeon offers a brilliant psychological insight here. If you actually internalize the lie that God has forsaken you, the immediate, unstoppable domino effect is that you resort to self-rescue.
And self-rescue almost always requires sin.
Always. He gives the example of the bankrupt merchant. We should spend some serious time analyzing this scenario because the psychology is incredibly relevant today. Imagine a merchant whose business is failing. The market has turned against him. His ships have sunk. His inventory is useless.
Let's modernize it. It's a startup founder. They've burned through their venture capital. The product launch failed. The payroll is due on Friday, and there is no money in the bank. They are facing absolute public ruin.
Perfect parallel. Now, if that founder maintains their trust that God is with them in the crisis, they will face the bankruptcy honestly. They will gather the employees, admit the failure, close the doors, and face the humiliation. They might lose their house, their reputation might take a severe hit, but they will not falsify the metrics. They will not lie to the investors to get one more round of funding.
But if the enemy successfully lands that fiery dart, if that founder is sitting in the dark office at 2 a.m., staring at the glowing red numbers on the spreadsheet, and they believe God has abandoned them to ruin, the internal logic shifts entirely.
The founder thinks, God is not going to provide a miracle. God is not going to deliver me. Therefore, I must deliver myself. And right there, the temptation to adopt dishonest expedients becomes overwhelmingly logical.
You can visualize the exact moment. They are looking at the user engagement metrics. The numbers are disastrous. If God is with them, they close the laptop and face the storm tomorrow.
Right?
If God has forsaken them, they reach for the keyboard to artificially inflate the numbers. They rationalize the fraud instantly. I have to protect my employees. I have to protect my family. God is not doing his job, so I have to do whatever it takes to survive. The lie of abandonment gives direct birth to the action of fraud.
This brings up a critical point about the sheer audacity of the lie itself. Spurgeon points out what he calls the satanic stamp on this specific fiery dart. He says you can see the cloven foot and the horn stamped right into the wood of the arrow.
That's a vivid image.
Why? Because doubting God's presence isn't just a personal crisis of self-confidence. Theologically speaking, harboring this doubt is the equivalent of accusing God of perjury.
That is a staggering way to frame a panic attack, accusing God of perjury.
It's a heavy claim, but logically sound within the framework of Reformed theology. God has made a covenant oath. He has stated, explicitly and repeatedly, I will never leave you nor forsake you. He bound himself to that promise through the work of Christ. So when the enemy suggests that God has forsaken you, he is asking you to believe that God actively breaks his sovereign oaths.
He's asking you to look at the creator of the universe, look at the blood of the covenant, and call God a liar. You are concluding that God is the kind of entity who runs back on the legal covenant he made with Christ on your behalf.
So when you entertain that dark thought, you're essentially agreeing with a cosmic slander against the character of God. You're suggesting he is either too weak to keep his promise in your specific situation, or he is too fickle and moody to maintain his love. That is why Spurgeon calls it the devil's masterpiece. It attacks the very bedrock of the believer's security while simultaneously insulting the integrity of the Creator.
All right, so we clearly see the threat. The arrow is in the air, aimed right at the chest. Now we need to look at the defense mechanism. Spurgeon points to the divine buckler. He says, the shield is the objective historical fact that God has never forsaken those who seek him. And here we plunge into a massive theological framework.
Spurgeon leans heavily into the doctrine of the final perseverance of the saints. He argues that the absolute, unbreakable security of the believer is the only thing that makes the gospel a functional reality.
He uses that stark, contrasting imagery. He says, if a child of God could actually fall from grace, if God could be pushed to the point where he finally abandons you to perish everlastingly, then the entire gospel is nothing but a mud hovel.
A mud hovel, yes.
It's a flimsy structure built on a foundation of wood, hay, straw, and stubble. It is not a fortress. It's a shack that the enemy can easily kick the door in and steal your treasures.
His logic is tight. If your final salvation depends on your own daily ability to maintain a perfect grip on God, you will inevitably let go. Human hands grow tired. Human resolve breaks. The mud hovel washes away the moment a surface storm hits.
You need something stronger.
Well, yes, you do. Spurgeon points away from human resolve and points directly to the attributes of God. He describes an unchanging God, a God who manages an everlasting covenant, a God who offers sure, guaranteed mercy.
Okay, I'm going to challenge this on behalf of the listener.
Yeah.
We're talking about vast cosmic theology, the everlasting covenant, sure, mercy. But how does the certainty of eternal security practically function as a shield in a moment of intense present-day panic?
What do you mean?
Let's say someone is sitting in an uncomfortable plastic chair in a hospital emergency room, waiting for a doctor to come out and tell them if a tumor is malignant. How does the abstract theological concept of the perseverance of the saints stop the physical symptoms of a panic attack in that waiting room?
Because that specific theology completely redefines the nature of the crisis you are sitting in. If God is entirely unchanging and his covenant with you is everlasting and unbreakable, then the terrifying event in the emergency room is not a sign of his abandonment. It legally cannot be.
Because the covenant forbids it.
Yes, the premise of the covenant forbids God from abandoning you. Therefore, the crisis, no matter how painful, must be part of a sovereign, meticulously managed process.
It removes the element of random chaos from the suffering.
Right. You may be in immense physical or emotional pain, but you are not adrift in a random, cruel universe. You are anchored to a divine oath that cannot be broken. It provides a solid floor under the panic. You can say, this tumor might take my life, but it cannot take my soul because God cannot break his word.
To prove that this theological point isn't just abstract theory cooked up in a seminary, Spurgeon does something brilliant. He essentially turns the text into a courtroom, and he calls a series of ancient witnesses to the stand to testify about God's actual track record in history.
And we should examine these witnesses in detail because their testimonies are not sanitized Sunday school stories. They are gritty, desperate accounts of severe human failure and panic met by divine faithfulness.
Let's call witness number 1 to the stand, the patriarch Jacob. Jacob is a fascinating psychological study because his default operating system seems to be pure anxiety, manipulation, and seeming.
Jacob's entire life is a masterclass in trying to outsmart providence because he constantly fears God will not provide for him. Spurgeon highlights that defining moment at the brook Jabbok. Let's set the scene. Jacob is about to meet his estranged brother Esau.
The brother who wanted to kill him.
Yes. The last time they interacted, decades earlier, Esau was threatening to murder him because Jacob had manipulated their father and stolen Esau's blessing. Now Jacob gets word that Esau is marching toward him across the desert, and he's bringing an army of 400 men.
Jacob is out of his mind with terror. He divides his family, his wives, his children, his flocks into separate camps, calculating that if Esau slaughters the first camp, the second camp might have time to run away.
He's strategizing based on total fear.
He's relied on his own cunning his entire life, but standing by that river in the dark, his cunning has entirely run out. He is alone. He is terrified, and he wrestles with the angel of the Lord until his hip is thrown out of joint. He crosses that brook the next morning limping, full of fear and trembling, expecting a massacre. But what actually happens?
Esau runs toward him, falls on his neck, and kisses him. The army of 400 men just stands there and watches as the two brothers weep in the dust. God had sovereignly turned Esau's heart before Jacob even crossed the river. But Spurgeon doesn't stop with Jacob's early years. He moves forward to the great defining trauma of Jacob's old age, the apparent loss of his favorite son, Joseph.
This is a brutal psychological crushing. Jacob is handed the blood-soaked coat of many colors. He assumes Joseph has been ripped to pieces by a wild animal. He refuses all comfort. He states plainly, "My gray hairs shall be brought with sorrow to the grave." He intends to mourn until he dies, and he lives with that heavy, dark grief for decades.
And then the situation gets even worse. Severe famine hits the entire region. Starvation is imminent. Jacob has to send his remaining sons to Egypt to buy grain. The harsh, powerful governor of Egypt, who unbeknownst to them, is actually Joseph, accuses them of being spies.
Right.
He keeps Simeon chained up in a dungeon as a hostage and demands they return home and bring their youngest brother Benjamin back to Egypt to prove their story.
Put yourself in Jacob's mind at this moment. He has mourned Joseph for years. Now, Simeon is locked in a foreign prison, likely to be executed, and they are demanding he hand over Benjamin, the only remaining son of his favorite wife. The stress is unimaginable. Jacob cries out in absolute despair, "Joseph is not, and Simeon is not, and now you will take Benjamin away. All these things are against me."
All these things are against me. That sentence is the exact, vocalized sentiment of the fiery dart. He genuinely believes Providence is trying to destroy his family. But what is the hidden reality operating behind the scenes?
The reality is that everything was actively working for him.
Every single terrifying detail. Joseph, the son he mourned is dead, was sitting on a throne, managing the wealth of the greatest empire on earth. And what was Joseph doing? He was specifically preparing a habitation in Goshen to save Jacob's entire family from starving to death in the famine.
And Simeon being locked up.
Simeon being held as a hostage in a dungeon wasn't a tragedy. It was a guaranteed mechanism to force the brothers to return to Egypt so the family could be reunited. Every single thing Jacob interpreted as a sign of God's hostility was actually a vital component of a meticulously orchestrated rescue mission.
And so Jacob, at the very end of his life, leaning on his staff as an old man in Egypt, surrounded by his entire family, has to retract every panicked, desperate word he ever spoke. He stands in the witness box and testifies that God's provision was flawless. Spurgeon says Jacob's shoes were iron and brass, meaning God gave him the durable strength he needed for the incredibly rough, jagged roads he had to walk.
Which naturally introduces witness number 2, Moses. If Jacob represents the paralyzing fear of circumstances, Moses represents the crushing fear of inadequacy, the sheer dread of being unqualified for a heavy duty.
Let's look at Moses at Mount Horeb. He's been a shepherd in the desert for 40 years. He's an old man living in obscurity. He thinks his life of influence is long over. Suddenly, a bush is burning without being consumed, and the audible voice of God tells him to go back to Egypt, walk into the throne room of the most powerful, ruthless monarch on the planet, and demand the immediate release of millions of slaves.
And Moses immediately starts throwing up intense, desperate defenses. He argues with God, "Who am I that I should go? I am nobody. I am not eloquent. I have a stutter. I am slow of speech. The people won't believe me. Pharaoh will laugh at me." He feels completely, biologically, and socially insufficient for the magnitude of the task. He is convinced he'll be a spectacular failure.
But God simply answers, "Certainly I will be with thee." And let's look at the actual resume Moses builds after receiving that promise. The man who was terrified to open his mouth ends up calling down plagues that completely shatter the economic and military infrastructure of Egypt.
Incredible.
He leads a massive, chaotic nation out into the desert, right up to the edge of the Red Sea. With Pharaoh's army charging at their backs, Moses raises a simple wooden staff, and the ocean literally tears itself in half.
And it isn't just the external cosmic miracles. Look at his psychological endurance with the people. The Israelites were a notoriously difficult, constantly rebelling group. Remember the golden calf incident?
Oh, yeah.
Moses comes down from the mountain, carrying the tablets of the law, and finds the entire nation throwing a massive idolatrous party, worshiping a golden cow. The man who once claimed to be timid and weak takes the idol, furiously grinds it into dust, scatters the gold dust on the water, and forces the rebellious people to drink it. He commands a solid rock in the desert, and a river gushes out to hydrate millions of people. He speaks to the heavens, and bread falls from the sky every morning for 4 decades.
And how does his long, exhausting story finally end? Spurgeon points out that Moses, the man who started out terrified and weeping over the calling, dies peacefully on top of Mount Nebo. He gets to look over the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And as Spurgeon beautifully phrases it, his soul is taken away with a kiss from God. The witness of Moses is empirical proof that the God who assigns an impossible task also supplies the omnipotent strength required to complete it. He never forsakes the laborer in the field.
Let's bring out witness number 3, King David. David represents an entirely different category of suffering. He is the prime target of relentless, malicious public slander.
David's life is incredibly chaotic. From the very moment he steps onto the battlefield and kills Goliath, he is a hunted man. King Saul, his own father-in-law, throws literal spears at his head while he is playing the harp.
A man named Doeg the Edomite betrays his location, leading to a massacre of priests.
Later in life, when David is fleeing Jerusalem because his own son Absalom has usurped the throne, a man named Shimei walks along the ridge throwing rocks at David and screaming curses at him in public. Spurgeon points out that David literally became the song of the drunkards in the local taverns. The worst, most vile lies imaginable were circulated about his character.
And what is Spurgeon's analysis of this phenomenon? He uses a brilliant aphorism: the higher the tower, the longer the shadow. High moral character naturally attracts foul slander. It is an inevitable law of human nature. If you stand for anything righteous, if you attempt to live a holy life, the men of Belial, as the text calls them, will manufacture accusations against you. They will try to tear down the tower.
So how did David survive the psychological torment of constant nationwide character assassination? How do you keep your sanity when everyone is lying about you? Spurgeon quotes David's own internal realization from the Psalms. "My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from him."
He didn't fight back on his own terms.
Right. David didn't spend all his energy trying to hire public relations experts. He didn't run around trying to litigate every single rumor. He let God handle the defense of his reputation.
And the result of that trust. His enemies were systematically scattered. The teeth of the ungodly were broken. Saul died in battle. Absalom's rebellion failed. God defended David's honor when human courts were entirely corrupted.
Then finally, Spurgeon calls his most intense, sobering witnesses to the stand, the martyrs. And we must brace ourselves here because Spurgeon doesn't shy away from the brutal, gruesome realities of church history.
He begins with the ancient accounts from Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They refused to bow to a golden statue, so they were thrown into a furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal. The fire was so intense, it instantly incinerated the guards who threw them in.
And Daniel.
Yes. Daniel was tossed into a dark den full of starving lions for refusing to stop praying. In both of these ancient cases, the men walked out the next morning without a single scratch. God sovereignly shut the mouths of the lions. He completely removed the burning capacity of the fire.
But Spurgeon is a realist. He knows that physical, miraculous deliverance isn't always the outcome. Sometimes the fire actually burns. He moves his timeline forward to the later martyrs, the ones who didn't walk away from the executioners.
The physical descriptions are genuinely harrowing. He talks about believers stretched on medieval racks until their joints audibly snapped and dislocated, men having their eyes plucked out, flesh slowly torn from the bone with hot iron pincers, men and women dragged to death through the cobblestone streets by horses, believers chained to iron gridirons and slowly roasted alive over low fires. He even touches on the unimaginable psychological torture of a parent being forced to watch their own family destroyed, their infants killed right in front of them before they themselves were executed.
Staring at that level of historical suffering forces a terrifying, unavoidable question. Did God forsake them? When the fire was lit under the gridiron and the sky didn't open up to put it out, did the covenant fail?
Spurgeon leans with all his weight on the 8th chapter of Romans to answer that. Nay, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him that loved us. The witness of the martyrs is not that they felt no physical pain. The witness is that the spiritual presence of God in the midst of the agony was so intensely real, so overwhelmingly comforting to the soul, that it eclipsed the physical terror.
They didn't just barely endure the torture.
They conquered it. The pain of the body could not separate them from the love of God. The physical vessel broke, but the soul was held completely secure.
This is a devastating, airtight lineup of witnesses. Jacob proves God meticulously manages complex circumstances. Moses proves God supplies immense strength for impossible duties. David proves God vindicates slandered character. The martyrs prove God sustains the soul through the ultimate extreme of physical suffering.
But Spurgeon doesn't let the listener remain a comfortable, passive observer of ancient history. He makes a sharp pivot in the text. He takes the entire weight of this cross-examination and turns it directly onto the audience sitting in the pews. And by extension, he brings it directly to you, the listener, today.
He essentially says, you say God has forsaken you. Fine, step into the witness box yourself. Let's look at the hard data of your own lived experience.
He paints several incredibly raw, relatable scenarios to force the listener to reckon with their own past. Let's walk through them. Scenario 1. He asks the listener to cast their mind back to a specific time when severe sickness invaded the home. Your wife was gravely ill, perhaps bedridden. You had 3 little children running around the house needing care, and simultaneously, your business was failing. You were staring down the barrel of complete financial and domestic ruin. You remember standing in the hallway crying out in absolute agony, God, you have forsaken me. What will I do with these little ones? And then the pointed question is asked, did he actually forsake you then?
And the listener is forced to admit, no. I'm standing here today. My wife recovered. We scraped by. We survived the storm.
Or maybe the scenario he proposes is even darker. Scenario 2, a child actually dies of a fever. And while the house is saturated with that suffocating grief, the wife falls sick again. You feel like you are losing your mind. You think it is biologically impossible for your heart to bear the weight of the trial. But looking back at that dark year, you realize you did pass through it. You are still breathing today.
You have to confess that somehow, in ways you cannot fully articulate, the intense affliction was sanctified. You were held together by an unseen hand when you absolutely should have shattered into 1,000 pieces.
Scenario 3 moves strictly to financial ruin. He describes a businessman who experiences successive, compounding failures. Every single speculation breaks down. The inventory doesn't sell. The incoming bills are piling up on the desk. The absolute physical shudder of looming bankruptcy is keeping him awake at night, staring at the ceiling. He and his wife go into their chamber, fall on their knees in the dark, and beg for intervention. Does God leave them to starve in the street? The listener has to admit, no, I cannot explain how it happened. The math didn't make sense, but I came out of it. The provision arrived at the 11th hour.
And the final scenario hits at the very core of salvation itself. He asks the listener to remember the heavy, suffocating guilt of their past sin before they ever received pardon. Think back to the moment when the reality of your own rebellion against God was crushing your chest, and you finally cried out to Christ for mercy. Did he deny you? Did he laugh at you? No. He forgave you. And even when you stumbled and failed again after that, when you confessed it, he restored you.
So Spurgeon lays out this undeniable empirical track record. He says, look at all these Ebenezer stones in your own life, these undeniable markers of God's past help. He brought you through 6 massive life-altering troubles. Why would he suddenly abandon you in the 7th? It completely defies all logic. A sovereign God does not bring you through decades of fires and floods just to let you casually burn at the very end of the line.
It is logically unreasonable. To further cement this, Spurgeon brings in arguments from observation, from logic, and from nature. I love the simple analogy of the snow.
Yes, it is so grounded. He asks the congregation to just look outside the window at the snow on the ground. Thousands of years ago, God made a physical covenant with the earth back in Genesis. While the earth remaineth, seed time and harvest, summer and winter, cold and heat shall never cease. The snow falling outside is empirical proof that God meticulously keeps his physical covenants.
The seasons arrive on schedule, century after century.
So his argument is this: if God is that meticulous about managing the thermostat of the planet, why do you think he will suddenly develop amnesia regarding the eternal, blood-bought promises he made directly to your soul?
He also makes a brilliant, counterintuitive, logical point about the nature of trouble itself. You are experiencing severe tribulation, and you immediately think it means God's promises have failed. But Jesus explicitly promised that you would have tribulation. It is a guaranteed legacy left to the believer.
In the world ye shall have tribulation. It's a stated fact.
Right. So the very presence of the trouble in your life actually proves that God's word is true. If you lived your entire life and never had any trouble, never faced any persecution or sorrow, then God would be a liar. You have received the first part of the legacy, the painful trouble. Therefore, you can be absolutely logically certain you will receive the second part of the legacy, the peace and the overcoming.
He then appeals to the basic character of a father. He asks, would a decent human father permanently cast out a child just because the child was disobedient on a Tuesday? A good father might discipline the child. He might withhold a certain privilege for a season to correct the behavior, but he doesn't throw the child out into the freezing snow to be eaten by wolves.
If someone walked up to you on the street and said your own loving human father was speaking terribly about you behind your back and actively planning to abandon you, you'd throw that person out of your house. You know your father's character too well to believe the slander, so when the devil comes whispering that your heavenly father has forgotten you, you have to recognize the slander for what it is and tell the enemy to get out.
Furthermore, he uses the biological analogy of Christ as the head of the body. The scriptures teach that believers are literal members of his spiritual body. Can a human head simply forget about its own finger? Can Christ, who carved your name into the wounds on his hands, suddenly forget you exist? It's biologically and theologically absurd.
Okay, I have to bring up a serious, heavy question here. We are talking about God's track record of rescue. But how do we reconcile the idea of God's perfect track record with the harsh reality that sometimes the business does go completely bankrupt? Sometimes the sick family member does not recover and you have to bury them. We all know this happens. How does that harsh reality fit into Spurgeon's framework without breaking it?
It fits perfectly into his theology of sanctified affliction. The promise in the text is not that you will never experience catastrophic loss. The promise is that you will never be forsaken in the middle of the loss. If the business goes bankrupt and you lose your house, the believer within this theological framework understands that the bankruptcy itself is a necessary, calculated tool in the hands of a sovereign God.
It's doing something.
It is designed for a specific, unseen good. The loss of the business is not proof of divine abandonment. It is the severe, painful mercy of pruning. The outcome may be devastating on a material, earthly level, but the soul remains eternally secure and intimately held by the Creator. God's faithfulness is not measured by the positive balances in our financial ledgers or even the clear scans on our medical charts. It is measured by his absolute refusal to let go of our souls when the body or the bank account fails.
Which brings us to the final crucial step in this manual. We know what the armor is. We know the enemy's favorite, most lethal weapon, We know the historical, logical, and personal evidence that proves the armor works. But none of this matters if the armor is just sitting in a glass display case in the hallway.
Section 7. Wielding the shield. Spurgeon states very clearly that the buckler is entirely useless if it just sits there and rusts in the house. It must be actively picked up and worn. And the specific mechanism for equipping this armor is prayer.
He points out a tragic, almost comical human tendency. When severe trouble hits, what is our immediate reflex? We go rambling round and round. We pick up the phone and call all our neighbors. We text our friends. We post vague, dramatic updates on social media.
We are desperate for any scrap of human sympathy.
We spend immense amounts of breath and energy detailing our woes to anyone who will listen to us complain.
But human sympathy is a remarkably fragile trop. Your neighbor feeling sorry for you cannot deflect a fiery dart from hell. Spurgeon says we need to stop rambling to each other and stay in the closet with God at the mercy seat. He argues that if we took half the breath we waste complaining to other people and spent it in focused supplication to heaven, our entire psychological disposition would shift.
I want to highlight a quote from the text that is just incredibly striking. It's stopped me in my tracks. He says, "If you could perish singing, you could not perish praying on your knees."
That is a severe, ironclad statement of eternal security.
Think about the massive weight of that statement. You literally cannot perish while praying. Why? Because when you are drawn to the mercy seat in desperation, God is already there waiting. God loves the mercy seat far more than you do. It is his chosen abiding place. When you approach him with the spirit of adoption, pleading a father's love, it is legally and spiritually impossible for you to be cast away. Your ruin is mathematically impossible while you are crying out in prayer.
And Spurgeon, being a masterful pastor, anticipates the listener who is sitting there feeling entirely unworthy of this. The listener who hears all this and says, "This is great for the strong, heroic Christians, but I am weak. I lack sufficient faith. I don't think I even repent correctly. My mind is a mess of doubts."
He offers such a gentle, accessible comfort here at the very end. He says, look closely at the text of Psalm 9.10 again. "Thou, Lord, hast not forsaken them that seek thee."
It doesn't say them that have achieved perfect systematic theology. It doesn't say them that never struggle with depression or doubt. It says them that seek.
If you are simply looking for Christ, if your heart is just turned in his general direction desiring mercy, the promise belongs to you entirely. The very act of seeking him is the empirical proof that he has not forsaken you. You can take that specific promise, as Spurgeon says, and suck the juice out of it. It's a cluster of new wine meant to revive a fainting, exhausted spirit.
If we synthesize all the material we've covered today, the architecture of Spurgeon's argument is brilliant. He identifies the specific, universal vulnerability we all face, the crushing feeling of isolation and divine abandonment. He exposes it not as a random feeling, but as a deliberate, calculated tactic of the enemy. And then he overwhelms that specific lie with an avalanche of undeniable evidence.
He brings historical evidence from Jacob's family drama, Moses' desert wanderings, David's public scandals, and the martyr's physical torture. He brings logical evidence from the fixed laws of nature, like the snow falling in winter. And he brings personal, empirical evidence from the listener's own survival of past traumas. The knowledge of God acts as a literal, impenetrable shield, provided we actively raise it off the floor through prayer.
It forces a complete paradigm shift in how we view our daily struggles. The struggle is no longer a sign of God's absence. It is the exact arena where his faithfulness is actively being demonstrated.
So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to chew on today. We've looked at the data. We've cross-examined the witnesses. If God's historical and personal track record of faithfulness is entirely unblemished, if he has never, in the history of the world, abandoned a single soul that genuinely sought him, how does that massive mountain of empirical data force you to completely reframe the absolute worst-case scenario you're dreading tomorrow morning?
It demands that we view tomorrow not through the distorted lens of our rising anxiety, but through the clear lens of his unbreakable oath.
The terrifying waters might be rising to your chest, but the bedrock holding your feet is solid rock. Thank you for joining us today on Reformed Thinking. We will see you next time.